I remember that night clearly. For 12 years, I had lived on that farm. 12 years of watching the same things happen again and again. The animals worked. The humans took what we produced. And when an animal became too old to work, it was no longer useful. I had learned not to expect much from life. My name is Benjamin. I am a donkey, and perhaps that is why I have always been more willing to watch than to speak. But that night, every animal on the farm gathered inside the barn. Old Major had called us there. He was an old pig, respected by almost everyone, and after 12 years of life, he believed he had finally understood the rule that governed all our lives. We worked as hard as we could. We received just enough food to keep us alive. Everything we produced belonged to someone else. The eggs, the milk, the meat, the crops. Even the strength of our bodies belonged to the humans. They did not have to work the land themselves. They did not have the strength to produce what we produced. Yet somehow they stood above all of us and took the best of everything. And Old Major wanted us to understand something. As long as we remained useful, we would be worked. And when we became old, weak, or unable to produce anymore, what happened to us? We were discarded. Some would be sold to slaughterhouses. Others might simply disappear. That was the life we had been given. I listened quietly while Old Major spoke. He told the animals that humans were the source of our suffering. And then he gave us a different possibility. A farm without humans. A farm where animals worked for themselves. Where what we produced would belong to us. Where we would finally enjoy the fruits of our own labor. He called on every animal to rise up, to drive the humans away. The younger animals listened with excitement. Some looked as though they had suddenly discovered that another kind of life was possible. I watched them. I did not share their excitement. Not because I believed Old Major was wrong about everything. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps animals really could build a better life for themselves. But I had lived long enough to know that a dream was only a dream until someone had to live with its consequences. Still, that night, something extraordinary happened. Old Major taught us a song. Beasts of England. The animals sang it together, and for a moment, the barn felt different. There was hope in the air. Hope that perhaps one day we would no longer work for someone else. Hope that the farm might finally belong to those who actually worked on it. 3 days later, Old Major was dead. But his words did not die with him. The pigs were considered the most intelligent animals on the farm, and 3 of them began to carry his ideas forward. Snowball, Napoleon, and Squealer. They developed Old Major's teachings into a new doctrine. They called it animalism. For the next 3 months, they secretly spread these ideas among the other animals. And slowly something began to change. The animals were no longer simply waiting for their lives to improve. They were preparing for something. A revolution. I watched it all from the side. I had seen enough of life to know that revolutions rarely end exactly as people imagine. But that night, nobody was thinking about the ending. They were thinking about freedom. And soon, they would get their chance. Because the man who owned the farm was beginning to neglect it. And hunger has a way of making even the most patient creature finally decide that enough is enough. I had always believed that the humans would remain in control of the farm. That was simply how things were. But animalism, the ideal of Snowball, Napoleon, and Squealer quietly spread among us. I watched them work. They spoke to the other animals about a future in which we would no longer work for humans. A future in which the fruits of our labor would finally belong to us. I still kept my distance, but I could feel that something was coming. And then Mr. Jones began to neglect the farm. The weeds grew everywhere. The crops were not harvested. And, worst of all, we were hungry. Hunger has a way of destroying patience. One day, the animals had gone too long without food. We broke into the storehouse, looking for something to eat. Jones and his men tried to stop us, but there were too many of us. We pushed forward. The humans were driven away. Mr. Jones and his family were forced off the farm that had once belonged to them. And just like that, we had won. The farm belonged to us. For the first time, we were no longer working for a human master. I remember looking around and seeing something I had rarely seen among animals before. Joy. The animals were celebrating. They had fought for their freedom, and now they believed that freedom was finally theirs. Snowball, Napoleon, and Squealer then took Old Major's teachings and turned them into 7 commandments. The first said that all creatures who walked on 2 legs were enemies. Those who walked on 4 legs or had wings were friends. No animal was allowed to wear clothes. No animal was allowed to sleep in a bed. No animal was allowed to drink alcohol. No animal was allowed to kill another animal. And the final commandment was the one that seemed to matter most. All animals are equal. I remember those words. I could read them, and unlike many of the others, I understood exactly what they meant. For once, there was no difference between the strong and the weak, the clever and the uneducated, the old and the young, the animals who worked in the fields and those who could barely move. We were all supposed to be equal. The next morning, we began working the farm ourselves. And strangely enough, the work did not feel as hard as it had before. Perhaps it was because we were no longer working for Jones. Everything we produced would now belong to us. Nobody complained about the work. Nobody argued over food. Everyone seemed willing to contribute. The pigs took responsibility for organizing and supervising the work, while the horses, cows, chickens, and other animals became the main workers. Snowball and Napoleon quickly became the most active leaders. But even then, I noticed something. The pigs were already beginning to stand apart from the rest of us. They were the ones giving instructions. We were the ones carrying them out. At first, nobody seemed to mind. After all, someone had to organize the farm, and the pigs were considered the most intelligent animals. Every Sunday we gathered for meetings. We raised the flag. We discussed proposals. We voted. Snowball wanted to educate us. He believed that the animals should learn to read and write. Napoleon had a different idea. He was more interested in the younger generation. He took a group of newborn puppies away and began raising them himself. At the time, I did not know why. I simply watched. And I remembered something I had learned long ago. When someone quietly takes control of the things that will shape the future, you should pay attention. But the others were still celebrating. The revolution had succeeded. The farm was ours. Commandments were written on the wall. And everyone believed we had finally created the world Old Major had dreamed about. I knew better than to celebrate too soon, because freedom had only lasted a few days. And already the animals were beginning to discover that winning a revolution was much easier than keeping it. I remember the first days after the revolution. For a while, it truly felt as though we had built the farm old Major had dreamed about. Every Sunday we gathered together. The flag was raised. The animals met, and we voted on the decisions that would shape our lives. No human stood above us anymore. The animals were finally responsible for their own future. But even then, I could see that two animals were beginning to stand above the rest. Snowball and Napoleon. They were both pigs, and both were considered intelligent. But they were very different. Snowball wanted to change us. He believed that if animals could learn to read and write, they would become more capable of controlling their own lives. He spent his time teaching, studying, thinking about the future. Napoleon had a different approach. He was less interested in teaching the animals who were already grown. Instead, he focused on the young. He secretly took a group of newborn puppies away from their mothers. He said he would take care of them himself. At the time, nobody understood why. I noticed. I always noticed. But I said nothing. Then the disagreements between Snowball and Napoleon became more serious. Whenever one proposed a policy, the other seemed determined to oppose it. And eventually, Snowball came forward with his greatest idea: a windmill. He had spent months studying and drawing every detail. He believed the windmill could bring electricity to the farm. Machines could do some of the harder work. The animals would have more time. They could read. They could learn. They could discuss ideas. Snowball even imagined that eventually the animals might only need to work 3 days a week. It sounded almost too good to be true. Napoleon disagreed. He argued that food production was more important. What good was electricity if the animals had nothing to eat? The farm needed more food first. The animals listened to both sides. And on the day of the great meeting, we were supposed to vote on whether the windmill should be built. Snowball had almost won them over. I could see it in their faces. Then Napoleon made his move. He gave a signal. Suddenly, the dogs he had raised appeared. They attacked Snowball. Snowball ran for his life. He escaped the farm. And just like that, the argument was over. There was no vote, no debate, no opposition. Napoleon became the leader. From that day forward, Sunday meetings were abolished. There would be no more debates among all the animals. Instead, a small management committee would discuss policies and issue instructions. The animals were told that this was necessary, that leadership required intelligence, that difficult decisions could not be left to everyone. And then, only days later, we received another announcement. We were going to build the windmill. I remember the confusion. Napoleon had opposed it. Now he was ordering us to build it. The explanation was simple. Napoleon had never truly opposed the windmill, they told us. He had only opposed Snowball's attempt to interfere. Now that Snowball was gone, the project could proceed. The work would be difficult. We would need to work harder. We would have less food. But we were told that it was necessary for the future. I looked at the others. They seemed willing to accept it. After all, the windmill had been Snowball's idea. But now it belonged to Napoleon, and I began to understand something. The revolution had changed the person giving the orders, but the animals were still the ones carrying them out. Then came another change. The materials needed to build the windmill were difficult to obtain. Napoleon announced that we would trade with humans. Some animals remembered that dealing with humans, using money and trading with them had once been forbidden. But nobody dared to challenge Napoleon. The dogs were always nearby. And whenever Squealer explained a new decision, he made it sound as though there had never been any contradiction at all. Soon, Napoleon and the pigs moved into the farmhouse. They said their brains needed to be protected because they were responsible for leading everyone else. I looked at the commandments on the wall, especially the fourth one. It had once said that no animal could sleep in a bed. Now somehow it said something slightly different. No animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. I stared at the words. I knew what I had read before, and I knew what I was reading now. But I was not the only one who noticed. The others noticed too. They simply did not know what to do about it. And that was when I understood that the revolution had entered a new stage. The humans were gone, but power had remained, and power had found new owners. For a while, we worked as though the farm truly belonged to us. Then the windmill became our obsession. Snowball had spent months studying and drawing it. He had promised us electricity, machines, and easier lives. Napoleon had once opposed the idea. But after Snowball was driven away, Napoleon suddenly announced that we would build it. The explanation was simple. He had never really been against the windmill. He had only been against Snowball. So we worked harder than before. The materials were difficult to obtain, and soon Napoleon announced that we would trade with humans. Some of us remembered the old commandments. Trading with humans had been forbidden, but Napoleon explained that everything was being done for the windmill. And with his dog standing nearby, nobody questioned him for long. While we worked ourselves exhausted, Napoleon and the pigs moved into the farmhouse. They said the brains of the animals who led us needed proper care. I looked at the commandments again. Something had changed. The rule about beds was no longer exactly as I remembered it. Perhaps I was simply tired. Perhaps my memory was wrong. I knew it wasn't. But I also knew that saying so would not change anything. Half a year passed. The windmill was half finished. For the first time, the animals felt proud of what we had accomplished. Then the storm came. A violent wind tore across the farm. When morning arrived, the windmill was gone. All the work, all the effort, everything we had built, destroyed. The animals stood in silence. Napoleon did not. He immediately told us who was responsible. Snowball. He said Snowball had returned in secret and destroyed the windmill to take revenge on us. The animals believed him. Or perhaps they simply wanted someone to blame. From that moment, Snowball became our enemy. We were ordered to rebuild the windmill. Twice as strong. Twice as difficult. Food was becoming scarce. Napoleon ordered the hens to produce more eggs so they could be traded for food. The hens refused. They resisted. And Napoleon responded with punishment. 6 hens were executed. Their deaths were explained as illness. I watched the others become quieter. Napoleon appeared less and less often. When he did appear, he was surrounded by dogs. His orders came through Squealer, and Squealer had a new story for everything. He told us there was proof that Snowball had always been a traitor, that he had been working with humans, that he had betrayed us during the Battle of the Cowshed. Some animals remembered Snowball as a brave comrade, but Squealer spoke with such certainty that their memories began to weaken. Then came the meeting. Napoleon arrived with his dogs. The hens who had resisted him were brought forward. They were condemned, and when some animals protested, the dogs attacked. The animals who spoke against Napoleon were punished. The Sunday meetings were abolished. There would be no more debates, no more votes, no more questioning. I stood there and watched. The revolution had promised us freedom. Now animals were afraid to speak. Commandments were still written on the wall, but the meaning of the revolution was disappearing one piece at a time. And I began to understand something that frightened me more than the storm. The windmill could be rebuilt. The farm could survive without Snowball. But once fear became the way we were governed, freedom would be much harder to rebuild. I had watched the animals celebrate the revolution. I had watched them celebrate the windmill. And now I watched something else. They were beginning to fear. After Snowball was driven from the farm, Napoleon's power became almost absolute. There were no more Sunday debates, no more votes, no more arguments about what the animals wanted. Napoleon gave the orders. Squealer explained them, and the dogs made sure nobody questioned them. Whenever something went wrong, there was one answer. Snowball had done it. If a tool disappeared, it was Snowball. If the crops failed, it was Snowball. If anything went wrong with the farm, somehow Snowball was responsible. At first, I thought the animals would eventually see through it. But Squealer was good at what he did. He told them that Snowball had secretly been working for the humans. He even claimed that Snowball had been a traitor during the Battle of the Cowshed. I remembered that battle. I remembered Snowball fighting. I remembered him standing against the humans. But memories are fragile when someone constantly tells you that what you remember never happened. The animals began to doubt themselves. Then Napoleon decided to make an example of those who resisted him. The hens had refused his order to surrender their eggs. They had rebelled. 6 of them were eventually executed. The rest of the animals watched in silence. Then Napoleon called another meeting. He arrived surrounded by dogs. Several animals were accused of being Snowball's followers. One by one they were brought forward, and one by one they were punished. I watched the fear spread through the crowd. These were not the same animals who had once stood together against Mr. Jones. These animals were afraid to speak, afraid to question, afraid even to remember. The 7 commandments were still written on the wall, but even those words were beginning to change. I knew because I could read them. One of the commandments had originally said, "No animal shall kill any other animal." Now it had somehow become, "No animal shall kill any other animal without cause." I stared at the sentence. The difference was only a few words, but those few words changed everything. And the song Beasts of England was gone too. We were told that there was no longer any need for it. The revolution was supposedly complete. The future had arrived. But I knew better. The animals had not become free. They had simply exchanged one kind of master for another. And the saddest part was that many of them still believed they were living in freedom. They had forgotten what freedom was supposed to feel like. Then there was Boxer. Poor Boxer. He continued, working harder than anyone. Whenever the windmill needed rebuilding, he was there. Whenever Napoleon demanded more work, Boxer answered with the same words, "I will work harder." He believed that if he worked harder, the farm would become better. And whenever he had doubts, he reminded himself, "Napoleon is always right." I watched him and wondered how long such faith could survive. Because while Boxer was giving the farm everything he had, the pigs were taking more and more for themselves. The animals were producing more. The announcements told us production was increasing by hundreds of %. But our food rations did not increase. In fact, many of them became smaller. We were told that life was getting better. The numbers proved it. But numbers could not fill an empty stomach. And they certainly could not erase what I saw with my own eyes. The pigs were becoming fatter. The dogs were becoming stronger. And the rest of us were becoming more tired. The revolution had promised equality. But equality was becoming another word that only existed on the wall. And I had a terrible feeling that soon, the words on that wall would be the only thing left of the revolution we once believed in. I remember the day we finally finished half of the windmill. We were exhausted. Our bodies were thin. Our food was becoming scarcer. But when we looked at that enormous structure standing above the farm, we felt proud. For a moment, I think many of us believed that all the suffering had been worth it. We had built something great. Something that was supposed to bring electricity to the farm. Machines would make our work easier. We would have more time to read, learn, and live. That was what we had been promised. Then the storm came. It destroyed everything. The windmill that had taken us months of exhausting labor was gone. The animals were devastated. I watched them staring at the ruins, unable to understand how something we had worked so hard to build could disappear in a single night. Napoleon gave us an explanation. It was Snowball. He said Snowball had destroyed the windmill to take revenge on us for driving him away. The animals became furious. They wanted Snowball captured. And Napoleon gave them another purpose. We would rebuild the windmill. This time it would be twice as strong. But there was a problem. Our food supplies were running low. So Napoleon ordered the hens to lay more eggs. The eggs would be traded for food. The hens refused. They had already given so much. They resisted Napoleon's order. And Napoleon responded with force. 6 hens were executed. We were told that they had died from illness. I knew better. But by then, I had learned that knowing the truth and being able to speak the truth were two very different things. Napoleon appeared less and less often. When he did appear, he was surrounded by dogs. Most of his orders came through Squealer. And Squealer had become very good at changing our memories. He told us there was proof that Snowball had always been a traitor. He claimed Snowball had been working with the humans. He even told us that Snowball had betrayed us during the Battle of the Cowshed. I remembered that battle. I remembered Snowball fighting beside us. But some of the others were no longer certain. That frightened me more than anything else. Because once an animal can no longer trust its own memory, there is almost nothing left to resist with. Then Napoleon called another meeting. The dogs surrounded him. Several animals were accused of helping Snowball. They were brought forward, and they were killed. The rest of us stood there in silence. Nobody moved. Nobody protested. Nobody wanted to become the next victim. I looked at the animals around me. These were the same animals who had once fought together to drive the humans from the farm. We had believed we were fighting for freedom. Now we were afraid to speak in our own home. The song Beasts of England was banned. We were told that it was no longer necessary. The revolution was supposedly complete, but I knew what that really meant. The dream was disappearing. The commandments were changing. The songs were changing. Our memories were changing. And now even our ability to question what was happening had disappeared. The windmill had fallen once. We could rebuild it, but something else had been destroyed that night. Something much harder to rebuild. Our belief that we were all equal. And still, we kept working. Because that was what Napoleon wanted. And because animals like boxers still believed that if we simply worked harder, everything would eventually become better. I watched him return to the ruins. He lowered his head and began working again. I wondered how much more a loyal animal could give before there was nothing left to give. By now, the windmill had become more than a building. It had become the reason we kept working. Every day, we were told that once it was finished, our lives would become easier. The windmill would produce electricity. Machines would help us with the work. We would have more time to rest, to learn, and to live. So we kept going. Our workload increased. Our food remained limited. But the announcements told us that production had increased by hundreds of %. I knew the numbers did not match what I saw around me. The animals were thinner. The work was harder. And yet, we were constantly told that life was getting better. Eventually, the windmill was rebuilt. We stood there looking at it, exhausted but proud. We had done it again. Then the humans came. 15 men carrying guns entered the farm. They began firing at us from a distance. The animals scattered. Even Napoleon seemed unsure what to do. Then the men reached the windmill. They placed explosives inside. And suddenly, boom, the windmill disappeared. Everything we had worked for was destroyed in an instant. For a moment, we were frozen. Then something changed. The animals stopped running. They stopped being afraid. We charged. We fought with everything we had. Napoleon stayed behind and directed the battle. The humans fought back, but eventually they were defeated. We had won. Wheeler announced our victory with excitement. Napoleon awarded himself a medal, and the battle was given a name. The Battle of the Windmill. The animals celebrated, but I looked around. Many were wounded. Many had lost friends. The victory had come at a terrible price. Still, Napoleon wanted us to believe that this was another great achievement. And perhaps that was enough for the others. I was beginning to understand how easily suffering could be turned into pride. How easily loss could be renamed victory. After the battle, Napoleon ordered barley to be planted. A brewery was built. The pigs began drinking more and more. I remembered the commandments. One of them had once clearly stated that no animal should drink alcohol. But when I looked again, the wording had changed. It now said that no animal should drink alcohol to excess. Another small change. Another excuse. Another piece of the old revolution disappearing. Then came another announcement. Animal Farm was now a republic. There would be an election for president. There was only one candidate. Napoleon. He won. Of course he did. The animals had once dreamed of choosing their own leaders. Now they were choosing between Napoleon and Napoleon. The years passed. Some animals began to reach the age when they were supposed to retire. We had been promised that old animals would receive pensions. They would finally have time to rest, to learn, to enjoy the final years of their lives. But when an animal actually became old enough to retire, something else happened. They were taken away. We were told they had died peacefully in the hands of medicine. I knew that was not the whole truth. I had seen enough to know where those animals were really going. And then I began to wonder about Boxer. He had spent his entire life working for the farm. He had always said, "I will work harder." He had always believed. Napoleon was always right. But Boxer was getting old. His strength was beginning to disappear. His legs were no longer as powerful as they once were. And I knew something the others did not want to think about. When an animal had nothing left to give, what did Napoleon do with it? I looked at Boxer. He was still working, still pulling, still believing. And for the first time I was afraid that his loyalty would not save him. It might be the very thing that destroyed him. I had been watching Boxer grow weaker for some time. He was no longer the strongest horse on the farm. His body was beginning to fail him, but his mind remained exactly the same. He still believed in Napoleon. He still believed in the farm. And whenever the work became harder, he repeated the words that had carried him through so many years. "I will work harder." I watched him pull the heavy loads. I watched him return to work when the others were already exhausted. Even when he was old enough to retire, Boxer refused to stop. He had spent his entire life believing that one day he would finally be able to rest. But that day never seemed to come. Then, one afternoon, Boxer collapsed. He had been working on the windmill when his legs finally gave way. The animals gathered around him. He tried to stand. He couldn't. He told us not to worry. He believed he would recover. Napoleon announced that Boxer would be sent to a hospital. We were told that he would receive the best treatment available. For once, I wanted to believe them. Perhaps Boxer would finally be rewarded for everything he had done. Perhaps after all those years, he would finally receive the rest he deserved. Then I saw the vehicle arrive. It was an old van, and something about it made me uneasy. I looked carefully at the writing on its side. I knew what it meant. It was not a hospital van. It belonged to a horse slaughterer. I shouted. I tried to warn the others. The animals began calling out to Boxer. They told him where he was being taken. They told him to escape. Boxer was too weak. He tried to kick against the door. He tried to break free. He couldn't. The van began moving, and Boxer was taken away. The animals stood there helplessly as it disappeared down the road. I knew what was going to happen. The others did not want to believe me. They wanted to believe Napoleon. They wanted to believe that Boxer was going to a hospital. But I had seen enough. Later, Squealer came to us with an explanation. He told us that the van had once belonged to a horse slaughterer, but had been purchased by a veterinarian who had not yet changed the writing. He told us Boxer had received the best possible treatment. He told us Boxer had died peacefully, and the animals believed him. Or perhaps they needed to believe him, because the alternative was too painful. Boxer had given his entire life to Animal Farm. He had worked until his body could no longer carry him. He had trusted Napoleon until the very end. And when he became useless, he was taken away. I stood there in silence. I remembered the promises made during the Revolution. A better life, equality, freedom, a farm where every animal would benefit from its own labor. And I thought about Boxer. He had believed every word. Perhaps that was why his story hurt so much. He had not failed the farm. The farm had failed him. And the saddest part was that the others still did not understand. They returned to work. The windmill still had to be finished. Napoleon still had plans. Pigs still had food. And the animals still had to believe that everything was being done for them. I looked at the farm, place that was supposed to belong to all of us, and I realized that Boxer had given Napoleon everything he had. His strength, his loyalty, his faith, his life. And in return, Napoleon had given him nothing but a lie. After Boxer disappeared, life on the farm simply continued. That was perhaps the cruelest part. The work did not stop. The windmill still had to be completed. The animals still had to wake up, work, eat whatever ration they were given, and go back to work the next morning. Years passed. The farm expanded. Eventually, the windmill was completed. We had spent years building it. We had been told that it would bring electricity, that it would make our lives easier, that machines would take away the hardest parts of our work. But when it was finally finished, I discovered that the promise had changed. The windmill was not used to make our lives easier. It was used to produce profits for the farm. The animals had worked themselves to exhaustion building it. And now the pigs were the ones benefiting from it. The farm had become more productive. But the animals were not happier. They were still working, still tired, still living under strict rules. Napoleon introduced a new way of life. Work, discipline, obedience. That was now presented as the proper way to live. And slowly the animals forgot. They forgot why the rebellion had happened. They forgot what old Major had told us that night in the barn. They forgot what freedom had meant. Some of the younger animals did not even remember that humans had once ruled the farm. To them, Napoleon had always been there. Pigs grew fatter. The dogs grew stronger. And the rest of us continued working. Then I noticed something that would have been unimaginable during the first days of the Revolution. Pigs were walking on two legs. At first, the animals were shocked. The sight reminded them of the humans we had once driven from the farm. But Napoleon did not seem concerned. He walked upright. The other pigs followed him. And then Napoleon began meeting with human beings. They sat together. They discussed business. They negotiated. They behaved like old friends. I stood there watching them through the window. I looked at the pigs. Then I looked at the humans. And suddenly I remembered the first night. Old Major standing before us. His voice telling us that humans were the enemy. his dream of a farm where animals would be free, a farm where no animal would dominate another, a farm where all animals would be equal. I looked back at the wall where the 7 commandments had once been written. One by one they had disappeared. Now there was only one sentence left. I read it slowly. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. I stared at those words, and for once I did not need anyone to explain them to me. I understood. The revolution had not disappeared overnight. It had been changed one small rule at a time, one compromise at a time, one lie at a time, one sacrifice at a time, until the animals could no longer remember what they had originally fought for. I had always been called pessimistic. Perhaps they were right. But that night, standing there and watching Napoleon speak with the humans, I realized something worse than being pessimistic. I had been right. The animals had driven the humans from the farm. They had promised never to become like them. And now, I could no longer tell the difference. I have lived long enough to see the farm change completely. I watched the animals rise against their master. I watched them build their own society. I watched them believe in equality. And I watched that dream disappear. The humans were driven away. But power remained. Snowball disappeared. Napoleon took his place. Commandments were changed. The songs were silenced. Boxer gave everything he had, and when he was no longer useful, he was taken away. And finally, the pigs began walking on 2 legs. They sat at the same table as the humans. They drank with them. They traded with them. They became the very thing we had once fought against. I stood outside that room and looked through the window. I saw the pigs. I saw the men. I looked from one face to another, and I realized that there was no longer any difference. The revolution had promised that all animals were equal, but in the end, some animals had become more equal than others. Perhaps that was the lesson I had been trying to understand all those years. I had always believed that revolutions were dangerous, not because freedom was a bad dream, but because power has a way of finding new hands. And when those hands are never questioned, the dream can become another form of oppression. I was Benjamin. I had seen it all. And perhaps my greatest failure was not that I could not stop it. It was that I understood what was happening and remained silent. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories from great books, told from the perspective of the characters who lived them. If Animal Farm made you think differently about power, freedom, and human nature, share this story with someone who might enjoy it too. And if you want to experience George Orwell's story in full, with all the details and nuances that couldn't fit into this retelling, you can find the book through the link in the description. Thank you for listening. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.